A lot of people will think that there are only two ways to go about establishing a surplus. One camp is very much in the belief that like you only need a 50 calorie surplus and that's good enough. And if you're trying to mitigate unnecessary fat gain, then it needs to be super controlled and you need to barely see the weight going up, if at all. And I think it's a shame because with that argument, with that ideology of thinking that the surplus needs to be that minimal, I think in a lot of ways you kind of rob yourself in two aspects. You rob yourself from the ability to make meaningful training progressions. If you're just like constantly hovering just shy or just above maintenance, because realistically, there are going to be days that you're more active. There's going to be days that you burn through more of your fuel, and it could even be burning through more of your fuel from the training sessions that you're having. But we have to consider nutrition not just on training days, but non-training days, because realistically, this is when you're building. This is when the muscle, the adaptation is something that you're causing and you're incurring through the training, but it's post-workout. It's in that recovery state that you're actually able to build muscle, and you're not going to be able to build if you're in an underfed and under-recovered state. You have to understand the fact that the two forms of recovery that your body really gravitate towards are either sleep or fuel. And realistically, like, you're not going to sleep like 15 hours. Like, I mean, there's a point where that's too much. But if you are maxing out the amount of recovery that you can garner from sleep and resting and just generally managing allostatic load, then you have to look at the other component, which is food, fuel sources, calories. And if you're constantly teetering on maintenance and sometimes you're in a surplus, but then sometimes you're also in a deficit, that can make it hard to make meaningful progress week to week, which this is why, I mean, like, sure, if I start with a new client and they're like, okay, well, I don't really want to gain at a rate that is too rapid. Like, I'm a little sensitive to seeing scale weight go past this point. That's not that high compared to where they are to begin with. This is something that, I kind of walk them through. I'm like, if you're trying to build, that comes with the acceptance that scale weight is going to go up. And we don't necessarily need to put food so high that now you are gaining unnecessary fat, which that is really only something we can determine by having all those metrics in place, or at least having scale weight and check-in pictures in place. But if you're not willing to commit to see the scale weight go up, if like that's something that you struggle with, that's going to be a problem in terms of our building. It's also going to be a problem if you're not willing to commit to eating a minimum what you need to support muscle building, which it can be a real headache for people, and myself. Like, even in 23, when I compare these off seasons, like that build in itself, it was mentally very taxing. And I look back at my measurements. I did this in the bonus episode, where my measurements over the course of 4 months only changed like an inch and a half. My actual scale weight changed about 10 pounds. So I started that 23 build at like 131, 132, and I ended it when I got to 142. And the truth is, I ended it because I wasn't comfortable seeing body fat get any higher. And realistically, like, I still had some semblance of abs. I didn't have any kind of dimples or cellulite on my glutes. It was just a matter of like, I felt heavier. I felt uncomfortable. I didn't like how that felt. And at the time I'm like, okay, well, I know that if I need to compete around like a 125 range, this is already getting to a point where now I'm looking at, I'm going to have to lose a lot of weight. But realistically, when I look at those measurements, I'm like, I didn't actually put on enough like weight enough circumference, enough growth in terms of measurements compared to how much weight I gained. And looking back, I'm like, it wasn't necessarily a misstep. It was a learning experience. Whereas in 2024, I started my build high 130s. I think like the week before I started, I was like 136. I ended my build at 152. So there is a significant amount more weight that was gained. But the kicker is when you look at the measurements relative to the calipers, yeah, body fat started and ended a little bit higher than it did in 23. But I also put 4 inches on my glutes. And it's important not just to assess the areas that we want to grow, but also consider the areas that we don't want to grow. So looking at my waist measurement, both seasons, I gained about an inch on my waist, which to me, I can infer from this. I'm like, okay, so season in 23 where I built 1.5 inches on my glutes, 10-pound increase. Season in 24, 1 inch on my waist, 4 inches on my glutes. Pretty significant increase in the weight. But when I look at pictures and I compare those two physiques, it's like there was significant improvement relative to how I would have looked in 23 if I had just continued to escalate weight up into the high 140s or even 150, which it tells me that in 24, not only did I build more muscle, but I was able to get more out of a season that was relatively the same length in time and realistically at the same intake in terms of calories. Now, another thing I did on the nutrition side that I think is very obvious, but at the same time people fall short of, is making sure that even on days that I did untracked meals, even on days that I did go over because I felt snacky and frankly, there was either a social event or something going on that allowed me to justify going over my calories. These days, I still made sure to hit my protein. So I remember first time, I think Jordan and I were doing like a charcuterie board, and it was something like, it was like 7 or 8. And I was looking at like my fitness pal. And even though I was tracking what we were eating, I was like, yeah, like realistically, this is going to be more fat and carbs than what I would normally eat, what's on my plan, what I was adhering to at the time. And I was still noticing like I'm a little bit short on my protein. I'm about 30 to 40 grams short. And it was something that, we ended up having a discussion about because he's very big on like being adherent specifically to protein, like no questions asked. And at the time, it really occurred to me. I'm like, oh yeah, like it is pretty common. And it's something that I have been guilty of, but I've also seen clients do, where on days that they go over their food or days they do untracked meals, they'll actually pull back on all their macronutrients unanimously in order to allow for more budget going into that higher calorie meal. But at the same time, we have to understand that protein is so important when it comes to building, and it's not really something we have the luxury to skimp on, even if we're trying to put ourselves in more of a favorable caloric state. Now, I'll say both seasons, I was pretty honest about untracked meals and the amount of flexibility I would have with hitting calories. And yeah, sure, there were some days where I was a little more intuitive and I let my fats go a little bit higher, and then in turn I pulled my carbs down. But realistically, in 24, I was much more consistent with knowing that like, okay, I need to fuel at least to this extent. And even on days where I felt uncomfortable, even on days where I'm like, oh, like I just feel like my waist is a little bloated or I'm holding a little bit more water, I would still go in and be like, okay, I have a commitment. Like I've made this commitment in order to get through this phase and see at the end of it how much I actually built. And that requires having consistency, particularly pre-workout. Now, I know some of you are like, hey, I hate eating before I lift. Like I lift early in the morning and I don't like feeling my stomach full. I don't like drinking a bunch. I don't like having food in me. I love to train fasted. And I understand the psychology with this. I get it. But what you have to know is that this is absolutely hindering your ability to perform to the extent that you could if you had even just a small meal prior to going. And when I say meal, it doesn't have to be something that you make. It can literally be a protein shake. It can be juice. It can be a perfect bar. It can be something just to have a little bit more fuel in the tank before you go into your session. In the case of someone who does get up extremely early and they're like, hey, listen, like it actually is like, I'm not hungry at that point and I do feel kind of sick if I have to eat a lot of food, understandable. What I would do is at minimum have 20 grams of protein, 20 grams of carbs, and if you can have a little bit of fat to slow digestion, it's probably going to help in terms of performance. But realistically, what I would do is then structure my nutrition so that that final meal that you're having the day before is having a lot of your calories. And it doesn't have to be a ridiculous portion, but I would just make sure that that final meal the day before your session, if you are someone who trains very early, is adequate and isn't going to leave you waking up feeling hungry or feeling undernourished.